I stood in my son's driveway with 2 suitcases and a heart that felt like it had been put through a shredder. The California sun was setting behind me, casting long shadows across the pristine lawn he'd always been so proud of. Inside one of those suitcases was a cashmere sweater he'd given me for Christmas 3 years ago. Inside the other was the signed paperwork for an $8 million business deal I'd closed just 48 hours earlier. But he didn't know about that second part. He didn't know anything really, because he'd stopped asking questions about my life years ago. My name is Catherine Webb, and I'm 63 years old. Old enough to know better, you'd think. Old enough to have learned that the people who are supposed to love you can sometimes hurt you the worst. But there I was, standing on the pavement like a stranger, wondering how the little boy I'd raised, the one who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms, had become a man who could look me in the eye and tell me I was no longer welcome in his home. Before I go any further, I need to ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop a comment and let me know, because I want to know that I'm not alone in this. That someone out there understands what it feels like to be discarded by the person you'd have died for. And if you've ever felt invisible to your own family, if you've ever been judged before your story was even heard, then stay with me. Subscribe if you haven't already, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just my story. It might be yours too, in different clothes. Check the description box below for more stories like this one, stories about people who refused to stay down when life tried to bury them. The worst part wasn't the rejection itself. It was how quickly it happened. I'd driven 3 hours from San Francisco to Sacramento to see him and his wife Jennifer, for what I thought would be a normal Sunday dinner. My grandson, little Tommy, was supposed to be there. I'd brought him a remote control car that I knew he'd been wanting. I'd been looking forward to seeing his face light up, to feeling like I still mattered in someone's world. But when I arrived, Jennifer answered the door with a look I'd never seen before. Cold. Calculating. She barely let me inside before she called for my son, David. He came down the stairs with his phone in his hand, not even looking at me directly, and I knew something was wrong. The air felt different. Hostile. I'd walked into an ambush. David finally looked up, and his eyes were hard. Not the warm brown eyes I remembered from his childhood, but something else entirely. Something that reminded me of his father, my ex-husband Richard, in his cruelest moments. That's when I knew. Whatever was about to happen, it was going to hurt. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He asked me straight out if it was true that I'd been laid off from my job. My heart sank. I'd mentioned it casually to Jennifer during a phone call 2 weeks earlier, trying to be honest, trying to keep the lines of communication open. I told her I was going through a career transition. I never used the word laid off, but apparently, that's how she translated it to David. And apparently, that's all he needed to hear. I tried to explain. Tried to tell him that yes, I'd left my position at the consulting firm, but that I was working on something else, something big. The words felt clumsy in my mouth because I couldn't tell him the whole truth yet. The deal I'd been working on for 8 months, the sale of a proprietary software system I'd developed to a major tech company, was confidential until all the paperwork cleared. I'd signed NDAs. I couldn't just blurt it out over awkward small talk in his entryway. But David didn't want to hear about confidentiality or future plans. He wanted to hear that I had a steady paycheck, a traditional job, something he could understand and approve of. When I couldn't give him that answer, I watched his face close off completely. Jennifer stood behind him with her arms crossed, nodding along like she'd orchestrated this whole confrontation. Maybe she had. What came next still plays in my mind like a nightmare I can't wake up from. David told me that he and Jennifer had been talking, and they decided they couldn't have me depending on them during my financial difficulties. The way he said those words, with air quotes and everything, made me feel about 2 inches tall. I tried to tell him I wasn't asking for anything, that I'd never asked them for money, not once in his entire adult life. But he talked right over me. He said they had Tommy to think about, that they needed to be responsible, that they couldn't have instability around their son. Each word was like a small knife, precise and deliberate. I looked past him to see if I could spot Tommy, my 7-year-old grandson who called me Grandma Kitty, and still believed I hung the moon. But he was nowhere in sight. They'd made sure of that. That's when David said it. The thing that broke something inside me that I'm not sure has fully healed even now. He said, "Mom, I think it's best if you leave and get your life together. We can't be your safety net." If you've ever been betrayed by someone you sacrificed everything for, you know exactly how I felt in that moment. It's not just hurt. It's not just anger. It's this hollowing out sensation, like someone reached inside your chest and scooped out everything that made you feel human. I'd worked 3 jobs to put David through college. I'd gone without so he could have. I'd been there for every scraped knee, every broken heart, every moment he needed me. And now I was being treated like a burden, like some distant relative who'd overstayed her welcome. I wanted to scream. I wanted to show him the contract in my suitcase, to wave it in his face and watch his expression change. But something stopped me. Pride, maybe. Or hurt that ran so deep it turned into something else entirely. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be better than this, and I made a decision. I said nothing. I picked up my suitcases, walked back to my car, and drove away. In my rearview mirror, I could see David standing in the doorway, arms crossed, watching me leave like I was a problem he'd just solved. Jennifer appeared beside him, and they went back inside together, closing the door on me in every way possible. I drove for an hour before I had to pull over. I sat in a rest stop parking lot and cried harder than I'd cried since my mother died. Not just for what had happened, but for what it meant. My son didn't know me, didn't trust me, didn't think I was capable of taking care of myself. After everything I'd survived, divorce, rebuilding my career in my 40s, clawing my way up in a male-dominated industry, creating something from nothing, he saw me as a failure, as someone to be ashamed of. That's when the anger started to creep in. Not the hot, explosive kind, but something colder, more calculated. I thought about that $8 million deal. I thought about the money that would hit my account in less than a week. And I thought about David and Jennifer in that perfect house with their perfect life, so sure they'd done the right thing by cutting me loose. I wiped my eyes, started the car, and began to drive back to San Francisco. But I wasn't the same woman who'd left that morning. Something had shifted. I'd spent my whole life trying to prove I was enough, to my ex-husband, to my colleagues, to my son. And where had it gotten me? Thrown out like garbage. But I had resources now. Real resources. And more than that, I had a plan forming in the back of my mind. A way to teach David a lesson he'd never forget. Not through cruelty, but through revelation. I'd show him exactly who his mother was, and I'd do it in a way that would make him question everything he thought he knew. The thing about revenge is that it's most effective when it's served with a side of irony. And I was about to cook up a feast. The money hit my account on a Thursday morning. I was sitting in my San Francisco apartment, a modest one-bedroom in the Sunset District that I'd been renting for 5 years, when I got the notification on my phone. $8,200,000. After taxes and fees, I was looking at about $5.5 million in my pocket. More money than I'd ever imagined having, certainly more than David thought his unemployed mother would ever see. I stared at that number for a long time. Long enough that my coffee went cold. Long enough that the fog outside my window started to burn off, revealing the kind of clear blue sky that makes you believe anything is possible. And maybe anything was. I'd worked in tech consulting for 20 years, specializing in supply chain management systems. It wasn't glamorous work, but I was good at it. Really good. 5 years ago, I'd started developing my own proprietary software on the side, using everything I'd learned about inefficiencies in global logistics. I'd poured my savings into it, worked 16-hour days, taught myself coding languages at an age when most people are thinking about retirement. The consulting firm I'd worked for had no idea. When they laid me off 6 months ago, restructuring, they called it, I'd already been in negotiations with a major corporation that wanted to buy my system. That's what David didn't know. That's what Jennifer, with her judgmental eyes and her perfect suburban certainty, couldn't have imagined. I wasn't unemployed. I was an entrepreneur. I'd just been playing in a different league than they understood. But here's what killed me. I couldn't even enjoy my success. Not really. Because every time I looked at that bank balance, I saw David's face. I heard his voice telling me to get my life together. I felt that door closing behind me, shutting me out of my grandson's childhood, erasing me like I was nothing more than an inconvenient obligation. I spent the first week doing exactly what you'd expect. I cried. I rage-cleaned my apartment. I called my best friend, Patricia, and told her everything. Pat had known me since college, back when I was young and stupid enough to marry Richard Webb, back when I thought love was enough to build a life on. She'd been there through the divorce, through David's angry teenage years when he blamed me for everything, through every damn thing that had tried to knock me down. Pat's response was immediate and fierce. She wanted me to march back to Sacramento, throw the bank statement in David's face, and tell him exactly what kind of fool he'd been. But I couldn't do it. Not yet. Because that would be too easy, too quick. It wouldn't teach him anything except that his mother had money. And this wasn't about money. This was about respect. About seeing me as a person, as someone with agency and intelligence and worth. That's when the idea started to take shape. It came to me at 3 in the morning, the way the best and worst ideas always do. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about David's mortgage. I knew he and Jennifer had bought that house 5 years ago, right at the peak of the market. I knew they'd stretched themselves thin to afford it because David had mentioned it once, back when he still talked to me about real things. He'd said something about how the monthly payments were crushing them, but that Jennifer insisted they needed to be in that particular neighborhood for Tommy's school district. What if I paid it off? Not openly, not with any fanfare, but secretly. Anonymously. What if I cleared their debt and then just watched? Watched to see what David would do when he found out. Watched to see if he'd feel guilty. Watched to see if he'd even think of me. The more I sat with the idea, the more perfect it became. Because paying off someone's mortgage isn't an act of revenge, not on the surface. It's an act of generosity, of love. But in this context, with David not knowing who'd done it or why, it would be something else entirely. It would be a mirror, forcing him to look at his own behavior. It would be a test. I knew I was rationalizing. I knew that part of me just wanted to do something good for my son, even after everything. That's the thing about being a mother. You don't get to stop loving your child just because they've hurt you. The love doesn't work that way. It's not a faucet you can turn off. It's more like a chronic condition, something you learn to live with even when it causes you pain. But I also knew there was something darker in my motivation. I wanted David to feel small. I wanted him to realize he'd thrown away his mother when she was at her most powerful, her most capable. I wanted him to lie awake at night wondering who the anonymous benefactor was, never imagining it could be the woman he'd dismissed as a failure. I spent the next week researching how to do it. Turns out, paying off someone else's mortgage anonymously is harder than you'd think. Banks don't just accept random large payments without asking questions. There are forms, verifications, legal considerations. But money, as I was learning, can solve a lot of problems. I hired a lawyer, a young woman named Sarah Brennan who specialized in unusual financial transactions and had the kind of poker face that made me trust her immediately. If you've stayed with me this far, then you understand what it means to want justice, even when you know it might not heal you the way you hope it will. Hit that like button if you're invested in this story, because I promise you, it's about to get even more complicated. And make sure you check the description box for more stories about people who refuse to be victims of their own families. Sarah set everything up through a series of shell companies and anonymous transfers that I barely understood but was assured were completely legal. The payment would appear to come from a corporate entity with no traceable connection to me. David and Jennifer would receive a letter informing them that their mortgage had been paid in full by an anonymous party, with no strings attached, no expectation of repayment. A gift from the universe, essentially. The paperwork took 3 weeks to process. 3 weeks during which I heard nothing from David. No phone call. No text message. Not even a perfunctory email asking if I was okay. The silence was its own kind of violence, eating away at me day by day. I wondered if he even thought about me. If Jennifer had convinced him that cutting me off was the right thing to do. If Tommy asked where Grandma Kitty had gone. I filled the time by finally doing some things for myself. I hired a financial advisor to help me invest the money wisely. I started looking at condos to buy instead of continuing to rent. I booked a trip to Italy. Something I'd always wanted to do but never had the time or money for. I was building a new life, one where I didn't define myself by whether or not my son approved of me. But underneath all of it, there was this constant thrum of anticipation. I was waiting for the moment when David would find out about the mortgage. Waiting to see what kind of man my son really was when faced with unexpected grace. The payment went through on a Monday. Sarah called me to confirm that everything had been processed, that David and Jennifer's mortgage was officially cleared, that they'd be receiving notification within 48 hours. I thanked her, hung up, and then sat very still in my new condo, a beautiful 2-bedroom in Russian Hill with a view of the bay, trying to decide how I felt. I felt powerful, I realized. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I was in control of something. Not just my own life, but the narrative. I'd been written off as a supporting character in David's story, a burdensome parent who needed managing. But now I was the author, crafting a plot twist he'd never see coming. 2 days later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer it, but something made me pick up. It was Jennifer. Her voice was shaking, somewhere between shock and suspicion. She said they'd received the letter about the mortgage. Said they couldn't understand how this had happened or why. Said David was convinced it was a mistake, that the bank had mixed up their account with someone else's. She was calling everyone they knew, trying to figure out who might have done this. Had I heard from anyone? Did I know anything? I lied. I told her I had no idea what she was talking about, that I'd been dealing with my own financial situation and hadn't been in touch with anyone who had that kind of money. My voice was steady, calm, almost bored. I asked her how much the payoff had been, playing dumb. When she told me it was $340,000, I whistled low and said that was some benefactor. There was a pause. Then Jennifer asked, almost carefully, how I was doing. Where I was living. If I'd found work. The questions felt perfunctory, like she was checking boxes on a form rather than actually caring about the answers. I kept my responses vague. I said I was fine, that I'd figured some things out, that she didn't need to worry about me. After we hung up, I sat there with my heart pounding. The game had begun. And I was exactly where I wanted to be, invisible, underestimated, and holding all the cards. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks during which I heard nothing directly from David. Jennifer called twice more, fishing for information, trying to solve the mystery of their mortgage benefactor. I maintained my cover, playing the role of the struggling ex-employee who was just scraping by. It wasn't hard. I'd been underestimated my whole life. I knew exactly how to sound small. But through Patricia, who had a friend whose daughter went to school with Tommy, I started getting information. The kind of second-hand intelligence that's more valuable than anything you could get directly. David and Jennifer were obsessed with figuring out who'd paid off their mortgage. They'd hired a private investigator, wasted money, since Sarah had made sure the trail was completely cold. They'd thrown a dinner party and spent the whole evening speculating about wealthy relatives or old friends who might have done it. They'd even gone to their bank manager, demanding to know more about the mysterious corporate entity that had made the payment. What they hadn't done, according to Pat's sources, was call me. Not once had David picked up the phone to ask his mother, his allegedly destitute, unemployed mother, if she was okay. If she had a place to live. If she needed anything. That hurt more than I wanted to admit. I'd given him an out, a perfect excuse to reach out. He could have called under the pretense of asking if I knew anything about the mortgage mystery. But he hadn't. Which meant I was still exiled, still persona non grata, still not worth his time or concern. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter. I had my new condo, my investments, my upcoming trip to Italy. I had Pat, who came over every Friday with wine and reality checks. I had my freedom, my independence, my proof that I didn't need David's approval to be successful. But late at night, when the city lights reflected off the bay and everything was quiet, I'd think about Tommy. About how he was growing up without knowing his grandmother. About how many baseball games and school plays and bedtime stories I was missing. And the anger would come back, fresh and sharp. 2 months after the mortgage payoff, I was at a coffee shop in North Beach when I ran into someone I never expected to see, Richard, my ex-husband. We'd been divorced for 23 years, and in that time, I'd seen him maybe a dozen times, always at events related to David. He looked older, we all did, but he still had that same self-satisfied expression, like the world existed to confirm his opinions. He spotted me before I could escape. Came over with his overpriced latte and sat down across from me without asking. Said he'd heard I was going through some hard times, that David had mentioned I'd lost my job. His tone was patronizing, almost gleeful. This was the man who'd told me during our divorce that I'd never make it without him, that I didn't have the skills or intelligence to survive on my own. Seeing him sit there, believing I was struggling, feeling superior, something in me snapped. I didn't plan what happened next. It just came out. I told him I was fine. More than fine. I told him about the software system, about the sale, about the $8 million. I watched his face change color, watched the smugness drain away and get replaced with something between shock and rage. Because Richard had spent 2 decades believing he was the successful one, the provider, the one who'd made something of himself. And here I was, his supposedly limited ex-wife, telling him I'd made more money in one deal than he'd probably made in his entire career as a regional sales manager. He tried to recover. Tried to act like he'd known all along that I had it in me. But I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was already thinking about David, about what this meant, about how to position himself in this new reality where his ex-wife wasn't the struggling single mother he'd always believed her to be. We parted ways after an uncomfortable 10 minutes. I went home feeling sick to my stomach. I'd broken my own cover, exposed myself to the one person guaranteed to tell David everything. What had I been thinking? But maybe that was the point. Maybe I was tired of being invisible. Tired of playing small. Tired of waiting for David to figure it out on his own. Sure enough, 2 days later my phone rang. David. I stared at his name on the screen for 4 rings before I answered. My hand was shaking. His voice was careful. Controlled. He said Dad had told him some things, that they sounded crazy, but he wanted to hear it from me. Was it true? Did I actually sell some kind of software? Did I have money? I could hear it in his voice, the recalculation happening in real time. I wasn't the burden he'd thought I was. I wasn't the failure he'd dismissed. And now he had to figure out how to adjust his narrative without admitting he'd been wrong. I told him it was true. All of it. I told him about the 8 months of negotiations, the NDAs, the confidentiality that had prevented me from explaining everything when he'd thrown me out. I kept my voice neutral, stating facts, not letting him hear how much he'd hurt me. There was a long silence. Then David said we should talk. In person. He said he wanted to understand what had happened, that maybe there had been some miscommunication. Miscommunication. As if there was any way to misconstrue what he'd done. But I agreed. Because I needed to look him in the eye. I needed to see if there was any remorse there, any recognition of what he'd cost us both. We arranged to meet at a restaurant halfway between San Francisco and Sacramento the following Saturday. I spent the week preparing myself. Trying to decide what I wanted from this conversation. An apology? An explanation? A relationship with my grandson? All of the above? I didn't know anymore. The anger had been my companion for so long that I wasn't sure who I'd be without it. Saturday came. I drove to the restaurant, a chain steakhouse off the highway, neutral territory, and arrived 15 minutes early. Sat in my car, checking my makeup in the rearview mirror, wondering why I cared how I looked. When David pulled up, I watched him walk across the parking lot. He looked nervous. Good. Inside, we ordered food neither of us touched. David started with an apology that felt rehearsed. Said he'd been wrong to judge my situation without all the information. Said Jennifer had been worried about their financial stability, and he'd let that worry turn into something harsh. Said he hoped we could move forward. I listened to it all, and then I asked him the only question that mattered. Did you ever call to check on me after you threw me out? Did you ever wonder if I was okay? He didn't have an answer for that. Or rather, his silence was the answer. He hadn't thought about me at all. I'd been a problem he'd solved by removing me from his life. And now that I wasn't a problem anymore, now that I was wealthy and therefore valuable, he wanted me back. That's when I told him about the mortgage. Watched his face go through confusion, then shock, then something like horror. He'd been looking for some mysterious benefactor, some miracle, when the whole time it had been his mother. The woman he'd deemed too much of a burden to keep around. "Why?" he asked, and his voice cracked. "Why would you do that?" I told him the truth. That I'd wanted to see what kind of man he was. That I'd wanted to see if he'd think of me when something good happened to him. That I'd needed to know if his love was conditional, based on what I could do for him rather than who I was. And then I told him the harder truth, that I didn't have an answer yet about what came next. That money doesn't fix broken trust. That I needed time to decide if I could forgive him, if I could be part of a family that had shown me so clearly that I was disposable. I left him sitting there in that restaurant, probably for the first time understanding that actions have consequences. That you can't uncook the meal once it's burned. That mothers are people too, with feelings and dignity and the right to be treated with basic respect. 6 months have passed since that conversation in the restaurant. 6 months during which my relationship with David has been complicated. We talk now, more than we did before, but there's a carefulness to it that makes me sad. We're like two people who survived a car accident together, bound by shared trauma but not sure how to be comfortable with each other anymore. David has apologized more times than I can count. Real apologies, the kind that involve taking responsibility without excuses. He's explained how the stress of the mortgage, of trying to keep up with Jennifer's expectations, of being a provider in a world that demands so much, had made him panic when he thought I might become a financial burden. He's told me that throwing me out is the biggest regret of his life, that he thinks about it constantly, that he'd do anything to take it back. I believe him. That's the strange part. I can see the genuine remorse in his eyes, hear it in his voice. But belief doesn't equal forgiveness, and forgiveness doesn't equal forgetting. Some things change you. Some betrayals leave marks that don't fully heal, no matter how much time passes or how sincere the apologies are. Jennifer has been harder to read. She's apologized too, but there's a stiffness to it, like she's going through motions she doesn't fully understand. I think she sees me differently now, not as the struggling mother-in-law who needed managing, but as someone with resources and power. And I hate that. I hate that my worth in her eyes increased because my bank account did. It tells me everything I need to know about what she values. But then there's Tommy. My grandson, who's 8 now and has grown 2 inches since I last saw him. When David finally brought him to visit me at my condo, Tommy ran into my arms like no time had passed at all. He asked where I'd been, why Grandma Kitty had disappeared, and I told him the truth, or a version of it appropriate for an 8-year-old. I said that grown-ups sometimes have disagreements, but that I'd never stopped loving him, not for one single second. He's been spending 1 weekend a month with me now. I take him to museums, to the beach, to all the places in San Francisco that make him squeal with excitement. We bake cookies and build Lego sets and talk about everything and nothing. In those moments, I remember why any of this mattered in the first place. Family isn't just about the big dramatic moments, the betrayals and the confrontations and the revenge plots. It's about the small, quiet connections that make life feel less lonely. I did go to Italy, by the way. Spent 3 weeks wandering through Rome and Florence and Venice, eating pasta and gelato and feeling like I'd earned every single moment of that trip. Patricia came with me, and we laughed more than we had in years. It was there, standing in front of the Sistine Chapel with tears running down my face because the beauty was overwhelming, that I finally started to let go of some of the anger. Not all of it. I'm not sure I'll ever completely release what David did. But enough that I could breathe again. Enough that I could imagine a future where we rebuilt something, even if it was different from what we had before. The money, as it turns out, is both a blessing and a curse. It's given me freedom, security, and options I never had before. I bought my condo outright. I'm investing in other women entrepreneurs through a fund Patricia and I started together. I'm traveling and learning and finally living the life I put on hold for so many years while I was raising David and building my career. But it's also complicated things. David knows I paid off his mortgage, which means he knows I could have told him about the money at any point. He understands now that when he threw me out, I wasn't helpless, I was powerful. And I chose not to reveal that power to him. I chose to let him believe I was struggling, To let him show me exactly who he was when he thought I had nothing to offer. Some people might say that was cruel. That I should have just told him the truth and avoided all the pain that followed. But I needed to know. I needed to see if my son's love was conditional. If I only mattered when I was useful. And the answer I got, as painful as it was, has helped me understand something important. I can't control how other people see me, but I can control how I see myself. I'm not the struggling single mother anymore. I'm not the dismissed parent. I'm Catherine Webb, software developer, entrepreneur, and yes, a woman who got revenge in her own way. But more than that, I'm someone who learned that the best revenge isn't about hurting the people who hurt you. It's about becoming so completely yourself that their opinions no longer have the power to diminish you. David and I are working on rebuilding trust. It's slow. Some days it feels impossible. There are moments when I look at him and see that image of him standing in his doorway, arms crossed, watching me leave. And the hurt comes back fresh and sharp. But then there are other moments, when he tells Tommy a story about me from when David was young, when he asks for my advice about a problem at work, when he says, "I'm proud of you, Mom," and actually means it, and I think maybe we'll find our way back to something real. The truth I've learned through all of this is that family is messy. It's imperfect people trying to love each other while carrying their own fears and insecurities and damage. David was afraid of being pulled down by my struggles. I was afraid of being seen as worthless. We both let those fears turn us into people we didn't recognize. But fear doesn't have to be the end of the story. Sometimes it's just the middle, the dark chapter before you find your way back to the light. I'm not sure what the final chapter of my relationship with David will look like. Maybe we'll be close again someday. Maybe we'll always have this careful distance between us. But I know this, I don't need his validation anymore to know I'm enough. I think about that day standing in his driveway with my suitcases more often than I'd like to admit. If I could go back and talk to that version of myself, the one who felt so small and dismissed and heartbroken, I'd tell her this: you're about to learn how strong you really are. You're about to discover that you don't need anyone's permission to be powerful. You're about to prove every doubt wrong, including your own. And I'd tell her that revenge might feel satisfying in the moment, but what lasts is the life you build from the ashes. The revenge was never really about David anyway. It was about me reclaiming my own story. Taking back the narrative from everyone who'd ever underestimated me. My ex-husband, my son, the society that tells women in their 60s that they're supposed to be winding down rather than just getting started. I'm 64 now. Tommy will be 9 next month, and we're planning a big celebration. David has asked if I'll come to Sacramento for the party, stay in his house. I haven't decided yet. Not because I'm trying to punish him, but because I'm still figuring out what healthy boundaries look like in this new version of our relationship. What I do know is that I'm grateful for the journey, as painful as it's been. Because it taught me something essential: you can be discarded, dismissed, and underestimated, and still rise. You can be knocked down by the people you love most, and still get back up. You can be invisible for years and then step into the light on your own terms, in your own time. My son threw me out when he thought I had nothing. But what he didn't realize, what I barely realized myself, was that I'd never been the woman who had nothing. I'd always been the woman who built something from scratch, who survived the impossible, who refused to stay down no matter how many times life tried to keep me there. And maybe that's the real ending to this story. Not revenge, not reconciliation, but recognition. Recognizing my own worth regardless of who else sees it. Recognizing that love doesn't mean accepting mistreatment. Recognizing that it's never too late to rewrite your life, to surprise yourself, to become the person you always had the potential to be. If you've stayed with me through this whole story, I want to thank you. Truly. Your time is valuable, and you chose to spend it listening to an old woman work through her pain and anger and eventual acceptance. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt underestimated or dismissed or invisible, then please, hit that subscribe button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And check the description box below for more stories like this one, stories about people who refused to let others define them, who found their power in the most unexpected places. Because at the end of the day, we're all just trying to be seen, to be valued, to matter. And sometimes the journey to mattering starts with the painful realization that you matter to yourself, even if you don't matter to everyone else. Even if you don't matter to your own son. I matter. I always did. And it took getting thrown out, getting rich, and getting even for me to finally understand that.